example is especially inspiring at the current time, when in so many countries around the world there is growing inequality, growing intolerance, and growing threats to democratic values, often aided and abetted by heads of government. Given the limited time available, I will read my paper and try to do so quickly. The title I've chosen is Cautionary Reflections on Affirmative Action Programs. It has now been roughly half a century since policies of positive discrimination in favor of stigmatized ethnic groups were introduced in the United States, and even longer since they were introduced in India on a nationwide scale. There can be little doubt that these policies, now commonly labeled affirmative action, have contributed significantly to the improvement of conditions for many members of the most marginalized beneficiary groups, although those groups remain far below the national average in overall well-being. After all this time, it surely makes sense to reflect on the achievements and the problems of affirmative action policies with a view to reconsidering how best to structure them into the future. The elevation of Donald Trump and Narendra Modi to power by electorates in the United States and in India provides us with all the more reason to re-examine the terrain on which the battle for social and economic justice is being pursued. A substantial fraction of the people who stand to gain much from greater social and economic justice have not been voting for politicians whose policies are most likely to benefit them. More concretely, a majority of low-income whites in the United States and low-income Hindus in India have lately preferred to vote for politicians who pursue nationalist goals and promote big business interests than for politicians whose programs are most likely to serve their own economic interests. Why do they do so? In the case of the US, a compelling explanation has been suggested by many people, among them Derek Bell and Chris Ladd, whose argument I will paraphrase here. Low-income white voters are rallying around racial rather than class solidarity, not simply because of racial animus, which does play a significant part, but also because the racial heritage they share with much better off whites has historically provided them with significant material rewards, as well as a degree of protection from abuse unavailable to racial minority groups. Ladd points out that more affluent and educated whites need not rely on their white privilege. They have very little to lose under policies that reduce the degree of discrimination and marginalization affecting racial minorities. But low-income whites do have much to lose when they face greater competition as a result of increased opportunities for victims of stigmatization and discrimination. To quote Ladd, "The shadow social safety net of white cultural supremacy is what preserves their way of life." And this group is especially susceptible to political appeals based on popular resentment against a liberal cultural elite that is viewed as out of touch and protective of the, quote, wrong people. As someone much less familiar with Indian than with American society and politics, I will not presume that this kind of argument can explain widespread support for Modi among low-income Hindus. For one thing, caste divisions within the Savarna Hindu population make cultural solidarity across social and economic classes more fraught among India's Hindus than among America's whites. But I suspect that the argument does have some purchase in the Indian as well as the American context, given that both countries have experienced sharply growing economic inequalities and a continuing, if not growing, significance of identity politics. The political scientists Hutchin and Bartels are persuasive in arguing that social identities and consequent group attachments are fundamental to understanding voting behavior in the US, and countless scholars have made this case for India. How does all this relate to affirmative action? I believe that the central contradiction of AA, and I will shorten, I will call it AA, the central contradiction of AA in practice has been that in order to eliminate inequalities based on race, caste, tribe, or religion, AA has focused on creating programs based on race, caste, tribe, or religion. thereby focusing attention precisely on those identities. I will use the term ethnicity to encompass all such forms of identity, excluding gender, which raises somewhat different and equally important issues. As the African-American scholars Barbara and Karen Fields have written, in talking about race, even racial justice and racial equality, we run the risk of reinforcing the project of racism, a kind of essentializing of race. Ethnicity-based AA has undoubtedly done a great deal of good in reducing the degree of marginalization of stigmatized identity groups around the world, notably in the US and India. But I believe that the resultant benefits to society have been partially offset by some costs. And the central contradiction is at the heart of what is arguably the most salient cost, namely that these programs tend to heighten rather than diminish consciousness of identity distinctions. No doubt the invidiousness nature of such distinctions was the work of the more powerful groups who historically imposed and benefited from them. But AA policies on behalf of particular groups, while benefiting victims of discrimination, necessarily tend to reinforce the relevance of identity distinctions. In recent times, this side effect of ethnicity-based AA has arguably contributed to the generation of a backlash against members of stigmatized groups on the part of members of other, less marginalized groups, especially those who are in some respects more often economic than social, not much better off than members of groups benefiting from AA. There is good reason to believe that this kind of backlash played a part in the rise of Donald Trump. And perhaps also in the case of Narendra Modi, though I will leave it to Indian scholars to make that determination. But their campaigns clearly appeal to economically depressed members of majority ethnic groups, whites and Hindus, often playing on their resentment at minority groups favored by AA. To some extent, the success of this appeal was surely due to outright racism and casteism. But I submit that support for politicians like Trump and Modi is also due to a widespread feeling on the part of economically precarious members of majority ethnic groups that they are in economic competition with members of stigmatized minority groups, and that AA policies conferred by well-off progressive politicians have conferred unfair advantages on the latter in this competition. This perception reinforces ethnic consciousness at the expense of class consciousness among the majority group, precariat, thereby making it harder to promote the social and economic advancement that AA policies are designed to achieve. Now, it's certainly tempting to dismiss the backlash against ethnicity-based AA as a remnant of long-standing prejudice, exacerbated by unscrupulous politicians, and to respond by reaffirming the need to strengthen AA policies that focus on leveling the playing field for members of the most stigmatized ethnic groups. Such policies have made and continue to make perfectly moral and logical sense as a way to achieve a more just society and ultimately a more successful economy as well. But if they cannot be enacted or adequately implemented because of widespread opposition, they will not accomplish their objectives. And if they generate a backlash that brings reactionary politicians to power, they compromise all kinds of progressive policies. To continue to make significant progress in leveling the playing field, one must take account of the political environment in which policies like AA are contested. I believe that it would therefore make sense to reformulate AA policies so as to enable them to garner the widest possible public support in the context of actually existing political environments. So, what can be done? In this paper, there are many things that can be done. In this paper, I will focus on AA programs that provide favored access to opportunities in education or employment, as distinct from policies that involve representation in democratic political assemblies. The latter form of AA is somewhat less controversial than the former, since in a representative democracy, it is reasonable for particular ethnic groups to expect that their group should not be significantly underrepresented in the political arena. In the spheres of education and employment, however, there is no presumption that members of different groups should be equally represented, The selection of candidates for admission to educational institutions or applicants to be hired for a job must clearly involve considerations of qualification and merit. AA in these spheres has the effect of transferring a potentially valuable resource to an AA beneficiary from whoever would otherwise have received it. Indeed, many of those who fall short of being admitted or hired are likely to believe that their rejection was attributable to AA, even if it certainly was not, adding significantly to the number of unhappy self-perceived losers from AA. This makes it all the more desirable to seek ways to implement AA policies that will minimize resentment and political backlash. The case for AA on behalf of any particular ethnic group is especially strong when members of the group have obviously, lengthily, and deeply suffered from blatant discrimination at the hands of a more powerful group or groups over a period of centuries, if not millennia. This is manifestly the case with African Americans and Native Americans in the US, with Dalits and Adivasis in India, for whom discriminatory treatment was integrally implicated in their country's history. To begin to address such an accumulation of wrongdoing, the very least that a responsible nation can do is to strengthen procedures for rooting out continuing forms of outright discrimination, if not worse, against members of destigmatized ethnic groups, such as inequitable access to housing, to employment, to bank loans, disproportionate punishment by the judicial system, etc. This kind of anti-discriminatory legal action must necessarily focus on a person's identity, since it stems from attacks on particular identities. More than such defensive action, however, is surely still needed to level the playing field for stigmatized ethnic groups, and this requires formulation and implementation of policies of affirmative action that are formed and shaped in the political arena. This means that to promote the rights and interests of ethnic minority groups in a democracy requires political arguments that appeal to a much broader segment of voters than members of the minority groups themselves and of the progressive societal elite. In order to maximize popular support for AA and related policies, it may therefore be best to structure them so that the benefits no longer go exclusively to members of particular groups. There are a variety of ways in which it's possible to improve opportunities of members of those groups without actually basing eligibility for beneficial programs on their group identity. The key is to highlight the kind of deprivation that members of such groups are particularly likely to experience because of past discrimination, and indeed present discrimination. Measures of the disadvantaged condition that anyone could suffer, which also captures fairly well some of the ways in which stigmatized group members have been particularly suffering and deprived, include lack of family wealth in land or housing, if not financial assets, lack of educational attainment of parents and grandparents, and residence in economically backward municipalities, cities, or regions. Now, one downside to focusing affirmative action in this way is that by virtue of including in an AA program some disadvantaged members, some very disadvantaged members of not so marginalized ethnic groups, it would reduce the availability of positions for members of the most marginalized groups. But this is a reality that may have to be accepted as part of the cost of maintaining and continuing, if not reinforcing, AA policies within a less hospitable political environment. Another downside, potentially, to the proposed approach to candidate selection is that it would exclude from AA programs those members of marginalized ethnic groups who, by virtue of their less disadvantaged backgrounds, would actually be best placed to make a success of educational or employment opportunities gained through AA. There are several ways, however, to limit the extent of this problem. That is, that one is focusing on disadvantage as opposed to strictly identity. First, one should seek to find better ways for admission and hiring officers to identify candidates with disadvantages in background and training, who, despite their more disadvantaged background and more limited formal qualifications, show the greatest potential for making a success of expanded educational or employment opportunities. This would require minimizing reliance on quantitative application criteria, such as standardized test scores that tend to reflect the extent to which applicants have benefited from a home, a neighborhood, and an educational environment conducive to high achievement. The degree of such situational advantage is largely a function of family socioeconomic status. What is needed instead is a more sensitive method of applicant admission and hiring that can shed light on a candidate's latent potential, which in turn depends on their native ability as well as their willingness to work hard and to persevere in overcoming obstacles. Secondly, one should seek to find ways to help AA beneficiaries overcome situationally dependent disadvantages in background and prior preparation. AA programs should not only facilitate access to otherwise unavailable opportunities, but also do more to assure that the beneficiaries can make the most of those opportunities. This is likely to require more education or training prior to entering a demanding educational institution or job. And it's also likely to require greater or more multifaceted support while in school or on the job than is now usually offered to AA beneficiaries. I recognize that some improvements along these lines have already been made via bridge programs and other support services. Still, much more could be done, both in the United States and especially in India, to move in this direction. Refining selection procedures, providing more preparatory training, and enhancing support services can significantly improve performance by students and employees disadvantaged by modest family backgrounds and relatively poor schooling and training. Of course, it takes substantial financial resources, as well as a good deal of time and energy on the part of administrators, instructors, employers, to provide meaningful help. Yet the extra cost would yield increased benefits in improving efficiency in the functioning of AA programs, thereby also contributing to the effort to make them politically more popular. To conclude, I do not want to exaggerate the extent to which ethnicity-based AA programs have contributed to the rise of Donald Trump, much less to Narendra Modi, as opposed to many other social, political, and economic developments in both countries. But this kind of AA focuses attention on ethnic differences, and such attention has surely helped to turn many of the less fortunate members of the dominant ethnicity in each country or region, in the case of India, into more of a self-consciously aggrieved group, unsympathetic with the needs of the most stigmatized.